So this podcast is in response to a question that we got from a listener who was explaining that her 6-year-old daughter says she hates being the oldest, and the mother thinks it's partially because her daughter doesn't like to share with her younger siblings. But we get this question in various forms consistently, which is the older children are resenting the younger siblings. They don't like the birth order and the family. And we do know this to be true for a lot of oldest children, especially in big families. It seems like maybe the load gets heavier the more kids there are that comes afterwards. And the oldest, regardless of whether they're the oldest of 3 kids or 13 kids, they can start to feel that burden and resent being the oldest. And we never want our kids to resent their birth order. Obviously, victimhood, they can choose to be the victim at any stage. So we as parents cannot carry that sole responsibility. We have to, our children at the end of the day are responsible for how they feel as adults about their lot in life. But I'm the oldest. I absolutely love being the oldest. I'm so grateful for my how my parents raised me. And so this podcast is going to be from, one person's perspective on how I love being the oldest. I just asked our oldest son before we headed out here on the podcast. I said, hey, do you like being the oldest? Or would you rather, be in one of your other siblings' positions? And he said, no, I love being the oldest. So he's only 7 right now, but I'm encouraged, and we want to keep staying that course because we really want each one of our children to appreciate not only the family they were born into, but the place in that family and God's design within that. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this episode. That was a long-winded intro. If you enjoy it, give it a thumbs up. If you are here on YouTube, share it with someone. If you feel like this would be encouraging to them, you guys get the word out there about the Now That We're a Family podcast. We are so thankful for you and just so grateful for this community of listeners. So thank you guys so much for being here.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Yeah, Katie, as you were talking through the intro there, it made me reflect back on an episode I think we did roughly a year ago. I think it was Red Flags in Big Families. And I think birth order is one of those things that you can hyper focus on to the detriment of your children and yourself. Like you can hyper focus on the order that you were born into your family. And then I think it is possible to acknowledge it. To underemphasize it to the detriment of your children. And so obviously with many things in life, we want to find balance, and we want to be able to approach it from a healthy perspective. And I think it is fun to even hear you say that you loved being the oldest in your family and that you currently love being the oldest in your family. Because that is the cool thing. When you have a multi-generational vision for your family culture and interactions don't end when your children are out of the house. And that certainly is the case with the families that we come from. Like we are we interact all the time with our siblings and with our parents. And we hope that to be the case with our children when they are young adults, that they are continuing to interact with each other. And so Leon's always going to be the oldest in our family, right? He's always going to be the oldest child, the firstborn. And we want that dynamic to be a healthy one between him and his younger siblings, just as I think that is with you and your younger siblings, or I think of my interaction with my oldest brother, the oldest in our family, and my older siblings and younger siblings. You obviously need to commit to continuing to grow in those relationships once you are an adult, but birth order is going to have an effect on those relationships forever.
Yeah, it also can really determine how our children view family when it goes to them procreating one day. We really want our children to have a positive perspective about raising children and growing up as a child, and not be like, okay, that was terrible. I want to scrap all that and do as little of that as I can. And we were just talking with someone recently who was saying that they felt like they were really part of that forgotten middle. And she was like, that stereotype, that was me. That was me and my siblings there in the middle. And so that is something that we're very in tune to with our children. And we aren't going to get this all perfect, but it's something we at least want to be aware of, like you said, and put some effort into. And then also knowing the weakness of the baby of the family too.
Yes.
Because we don't just want them to roll through life jolly and happy, but never really, just kind of underperforming,
yes,
I guess, for what they've been prepared to do.
That's right. Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking to one of my younger brothers, a few nights ago. And it was so interesting reflecting on our experiences growing up. We grew up with the same parents, the same siblings, and yet our experiences were pretty different because of the great age disparity. There was a huge gap in our age. And so even what my dad was doing for work was different when I was 10 years old versus what he was doing for work when, the brother that I was talking to was 10 years old. And as a result, it had an impact. And then also his older siblings were becoming young adults and getting married and having children when he was in those some formative teen years. And he's awesome. He's crushing life, and all my siblings are amazing Christian people.
Well, I would say your parents did a really good job sustaining that intentionality through to the last baby.
Yes.
Which is really hard to do.
Yes.
From what we've seen, especially when you have an 18-year, 20-year spread, maintaining that intentionality for the last 18 years, when you're also transitioning into grandparent mode, that's a challenge.
Yes, it really is. But I want to kind of keep the emphasis, like you said, on that role of the oldest child.
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about in this episode.
Yeah, exactly. So what are your initial thoughts regarding a child that might resent that role or that position that they are in? And what are different, pitfalls parents could fall into on different sides?
Yeah, well, I think one of the main complaints that you hear from an adult saying that they disliked being the oldest is that they felt that there was too much responsibility on them and it was unfair. It was to a level that was unfair. And I think that as parents, it's kind of impossible to take away the responsibility that is on the eldest child, because I do think it's God-ordained responsibility. We've heard that as the oldest goes, so the others will follow, and that's like a cliche, but there is an element, and we've seen this to be true in our own home, where you can get a dog pile effect going one way or the other pretty quickly with that lead dog of the pack, especially if you have quite a few kiddos following. And so, if our oldest son says he likes the dinner, well, first of all, he's looking to daddy, seeing Elisha's lead, to know how to respond. But if he decides the soup is good, then all the kids decide the soup is good, right? Except for the one contrarian who's going to go the other way just because they want to be different. But for the most part, you get this dog pile effect on your side, and it happens the same way negatively, where if you say, oh, we're all going to the park, and they decide they don't want to go to the park, then everybody starts moaning that they don't want to go to the park. And so that responsibility is there regardless of whether we put that on them as parents or don't put that on them as parents. The younger children, to a certain extent, are looking to the oldest child, even if it's just straight up because of age, to see, how do I respond in this situation, and for better or for worse. And something that was really freeing for me was reading the birth order book. I get a little burdened by it, and it's been nice to have some space from it. But something that stuck out to me was the author pointing out that in scripture, the oldest son, right, got the birthright. And that would be a privilege that oldest son got. And I always thought, well, that is so unfair. Reading the scripture and being like, and then you're second and you get nothing, right? Or a lot less. And you see all these fights happening in scripture over the birthright. I'm grateful that we don't have that in our modern culture, because I do think it could lead to a lot of sibling angst. But you see that, okay, there was this special responsibility. There were also these special privileges that came with it. And I think that that's something that my parents did very well growing up. I think so often as parents, when we're concerned about fairness, maybe we don't even realize that there's this extra weight placed on the oldest child. And so then we try to be fair in all the other ways. And it's like, well, you can't stay up later because your younger siblings can't stay up later. Or you can't do that because your younger siblings can't do that. And we try to be fair with all the rules, but then the eldest child is feeling more responsibility. And life isn't fair, but I'm just saying, if you're trying to be perfectly fair, it's kind of impossible.
Yeah, you're right. It's funny because I do think that this is an attitude that we've adopted in Western thinking, where you think there's more virtue in making it a equal playing field for everyone. So you're like, okay, regardless of whatever, you're a man or you're a woman, you're a child, you're the firstborn. It's like we all have to have the exact same experience. And obviously there's whispers of truth in all movements that catch, momentum. But I think of when it comes to the birth order thing, it's kind of like the lazy route as a parent, just to say, you know what, we're not even going to think in regards to who's responsible or not responsible. It's just going to be what you say, we're going to try to make it fair, even across the board. But in trying to do so, you negate some things that are inescapable. Like you can't escape that the oldest is the oldest.
Yeah, or the middle is the middle, or the baby is the baby. Like there's variables outside of our fairness control.
Yes.
So even if everyone's getting the exact same size sandwich, someone weighs 50 pounds more.
Yes.
It's just at the end of the day still not fair.
Right. That's exactly right. And you take the flip side of actually acknowledging, like the Old Testament, you go and point into that, of the birthright and the honor that came with being the firstborn. A great responsibility came with that as well. And I think of even family businesses now. There's that, the whole saying of like the shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve. It's like within 3 generations or 2 generations or whatever, the wealth of a family's lost or a business is done away with. Where it's like the person that founded the business or created the wealth can pass it on to his child, and they like maintain it, but they're not going to grow it, and then they pass it on to the next generation, and then they lose it. There's like this pattern that you can point to in society. And I think of businesses, just in regards to that, how much easier it is for fathers, for mothers to say, you know what, we're just going to sell the business. We're going to donate all the money to charities because we don't want this to become a issue for the kids. Because that's more times than not what happens when there's an inheritance left now. If it's 2024, when there's an inheritance left to family members, it usually doesn't end well. Like it usually ends in broken relationships, lots of bickering, lots of quarreling. And so instead of parents saying, you know what, we're going to take the responsibility to equip our kids with the character, with the values, give them the vision that we had in creating this wealth and starting this business, and then have a succession plan based off of that, that's putting more responsibility on yourself as a parent. And it's really kind of taking the easy route out to say, well, I just want to avoid conflict. And so we'll, when it comes to wealth, we'll distribute it beforehand, or we'll send it all to charities. And we view that as doing the kids a favor here in Western culture, which the Bible does not view it that way at all. It's
we don't see that
in the Bible.
Bible.
Yeah, you're like, no, you leave your children's children an inheritance, which means you need to prepare them to manage it and handle it wisely. And I know we're getting a little off course here, but I think there is something to just truly accepting and acknowledging and embracing the fact that the firstborn has unique responsibilities. And with that, I think should come some unique honor as well.
Yeah. So when it comes to, young kids, this can look different ways. One of my parents' favorite quotes that I really am grateful for is life is not fair. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's good to just accept that early and realize that, hey, our parents are going to do the best that they can, but life is unfair. So just buck up and live life. Okay. Don't be looking for the fair card, or you're going to be disappointed your entire life. But something that we do, here in our home are, like the book light. So our oldest, once he started to read, he got a book light, and it didn't affect everybody in the room or the other kids who were sleeping in the room, but he got to stay up a little bit earlier and read. Yeah, and that was, a little bit later and read. Another thing, if you can couple responsibility and privilege, that's really awesome. I think of something like, we have usually the oldest hands out the snacks. That was my role. I'm still known as the rationer in my family. But they have that responsibility of, they're kind of a little bossier usually in general. And so here you have the responsibility of handing all the snacks, and you need to make sure that it's fair, as fair as you can, or people start to nag you about that. If we've asked our oldest to babysit, so this is, we pay him.
Yeah.
And so, I'm going to say that loosely. We're always here at home when he babysits, but if Elisha and I have to go have a conversation, or we have a meeting run long or something like that, then we will pay him to babysit the kiddos. And growing up, this was for special things that I would get paid, or my sister and I would get paid to babysit. Often we got paid with a movie. And so when my parents would go on a date, say we're 10, 11, 12, and we're watching the younger kids, which honestly, looking back, was still kind of young. When my parents went on dates, we started babysitting our younger siblings, and us 3 older girls would do it together, and we would watch a movie. And that was something that, that was the only time we got to watch a movie. So we didn't get paid for that, but that was something that, happened later.
Yeah. And they made it a good experience for you.
Yeah, it was like a reward. So I'm not saying, I guess, you always have to pay your kids for like helping out with your younger siblings or stuff like that. But whenever there's this extra responsibility, sometimes I think it's nice if there's something extra special that goes along with that too.
Yeah, I wonder what the principle is that you can draw from that, because I think it's easy to anecdotally look at bad instances and positive instances. Like you said, growing up, your parents just knew, probably because they knew how they were setting it up with the movie and the fun time that you were going to have. Maybe it was even a special dinner that you got to prepare.
Oh yeah, chicken burgers from Costco.
See, there you go. Where it was a fun thing. And that's what I recollect too growing up, where it was like, yeah, we got to watch a movie, which was a rare occurrence. And it was usually like a fun meal, like pizza or,
we were
corn dogs.
stoked when my parents would go on a date.
Right. And so you have to know that, that doesn't require some, like the oldest child that's bearing the responsibility there, you understand it's also a privilege and it's also really fun. So when you're talking about, asking Leon to take the kids for 20 minutes and keep them outside and keep them occupied, when it's out of the ordinary, it's not fun. Like what we're trying to avoid, and I'm just thinking this out in real time here. What we're trying to avoid is what we've seen happen in other families where older siblings grow up resenting it because they're like, well, I was basically the second parent for much of because my parents were doing ministry, or they were whatever, like they were reading a book, they were caught up in their...
I think it's business or ministry, which is really sad.
Right. And they're like, well, I'm, by the time they become a young adult and they're married, like, well, I'm done being a parent. I don't want to have my own kids. Like I already had that season of life, and that's what we want to avoid. And so, again, it's hard to draw a principle of like, okay, this is when you reward your kids monetarily, and this is when the event itself naturally rewards them. There needs to be some discernment, I think, within the parenting.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And, we'll have Leon on in 18 years and you guys can hear from him how well we did this. Something else, like a little way, is we make breakfast together as a family. And I think of pancakes specifically because it's very clear how responsible you are in terms of what you get to do with the pancakes. So like the little kids, they get to take them off the griddle. But when you're a little bit older, then you get to flip them. And when you're even older, you get to put them on the griddle.
Whoa.
And so there's
nice.
all these levels. But sometimes if I have to go run and do something and I ask Leon to take care of the pancakes, it's like this privilege and responsibility mixed together because not everybody can do the job. And so he gets to do that. Something else is even like in a song, we give the oldest child or the child that's standing the best with their hands to the side and smiling, we give them the solo, right? So it's just little things of like, okay, we're going to expect these things of you, but also we want you to know that you're also getting an extra privilege that goes hand in hand with that, and coupling those things as much as possible, because we can't always just say, take away that responsibility, nor is it helpful to always take away the responsibility. I think it's good for our children to feel the weight of responsibility, like your actions are going to affect the whole family.
Yeah. And that's something I've thought a lot about recently, because we want our children to grow up with an element of feeling responsible, but also feeling privileged, because I do think with privilege comes responsibility. I think we're privileged. And I think Christians are called ambassadors for Jesus Christ. We are adopted into the household of God. We are joint heirs together with Christ. Hebrews says that it behooves Jesus to call us his brethren. I think of, is it 1 Peter or 2 Peter, that you've been given all things that pertain unto life and godliness through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so when you're a Christian, you are in a privileged position. But with that also comes a responsibility. And I want to be able to articulate, just as you learn to grasp the gospel more and more, you don't begrudge the responsibility. You see more and more the privilege that it is of being blood-bought and being a representative of the King. You're kind of like, wow, this is a big deal. It's humbling. But you also feel the responsibility, feel the weight. I think with our children, I also want them, of course, to have their primary identity be, oh, I'm a son of God. I'm a part of the family of God. There's a responsibility in that. But then going back to God's word, there also is a particular and probably more subjective responsibility that comes with being a Voteberg, where it's like, hey, here's the deal. This is just what Votebergs do in this context, right? And of course, that is the precedence is God's word, and it's being Christians. And so I don't want them to get confused on like, oh, being a Voteberg is being a Christian, or being a Christian is being a Voteberg, but to see that they, with the privilege of being a Voteberg, because I think everybody has unique privileges within their family and within their upbringing. Within those, there also are unique responsibilities, and I don't want them to begrudge the responsibilities. So I want them to see the privilege, but then not get complacent with it, not take it for granted, also feel the responsibility that comes with it.
And I think a lot of this has to do with communication. That's something that my parents did really well, is they didn't just expect things from me or expect things from the older half of us kiddos in the family. They sat down and explained why. And I think that even that little difference can make a huge difference. And sit down and be like, hey, here's the deal. All your siblings are watching you. And you really help us lead as the parent when you jump on board and have a happy attitude with stuff. It's really unhelpful when you go the other way, because that you bring all your siblings with you. And you have a lot of power in how you're going to respond to things and how you're going to interact. And I think that just having those conversations with our kids lets them know, hey, you're in a place of privilege and responsibility, and letting them see it for both of what it is, instead of just putting these expectations on our kids. And like you said, having them resent it. We really want all of our children to embrace responsibility and just shoulder it. That's something that we just try to run away from here in our culture, and it doesn't lead to very well-rounded or capable, full of character adults. And we want each one of our children to be able to be like, more responsibility, yes, like I'm the person that handles the responsibility, give it to me.
Right.
We want that all the way down for each one of our children. And actually, with some of our middle kiddos, we've seen already, okay, they need to do certain things on their own, because maybe the older kids are naturally taking that responsibility off the middle kids' shoulders. And we want the middle children to be able to grow and to be like, no, I'm my own man. I can carry that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's probably a common dynamic within, well, really any sized family when there's multiple children. But I know growing up, I was the fourth born. I was the second son. So the oldest in our family was my brother, Joby. And then it was my sisters, Bryce, my sister, Liddy, and then me. And how my brother was, I see so much of, like when I see Leon, I see so much of my older brother, you know what I'm saying? He reminds me of my older brother. And
then our second reminds you of your position as second son. Absolutely.
Where like Leon naturally takes responsibility. If it's just because we've preached it into him, because he is the oldest, and he leads the charge. And that was my older brother, which is obviously admirable. You want to like facilitate that and encourage that. And also, and with that, I'm sure there's going to come unique, pitfalls or challenges. But then the second, or the ones coming behind him, and this was the case for me, is you just are like, well, he's got it. Like
I'm not going to break a sweat. He's over there sweating his face off. We'll let him do it. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And so, and this is an ongoing, we talk about this all the time as adults, we joke around, about this subject often. And it was, my dad's mentioned it, it was a unique challenge. Like having a 12-year-old, like my brother Joby at 12 was like, oh, I'm going to get up at sunup and I'll work till sundown or later, and like, you'll have to drag me out of the field. He was that son, and he loved it. He loved the work. And I was like, why are we working again? Like, why? Like we've got plenty of food in the fridge. We've got, plenty of firewood for the next week. Why are we stocking it up for the whole winter? And obviously that came from a character flaw, right? Laziness or apathy. And it was a unique challenge to my dad to instill work ethic in me and to truly see it as being something that was being obedient to God, not just an arbitrary value that was like a family culture thing. It's just kind of like, okay, like this isn't just a family culture thing. This just isn't a family value. This is you as being obedient to God. You need to work heartily as unto the Lord.
Well, but you did get that. And that's the thing, is like, you are this workhorse and this person who carries responsibility, welcomes responsibility. When did that transfer for you?
I think the language was big time. It was just the emphasis, like my dad having to go out of his way to put me in charge of projects. I think of firewood. That was an obvious thing because we only had wood heat in our home. And so every summer and fall, we would collect firewood. And when that was passed off to me, well, I back up even before that. It's just filling the wood box, like taking on that job of filling up the wood box. Like Joby probably my older brother would have loved to be in charge of the wood box forever. But like the job got taken away from him and put on my shoulders to get the wheelbarrow and fill it up with firewood. And I tell you what, there were a ton of lessons learned with that. One, like doing your work earlier rather than later, because the worst was when it get dark outside and our woodshed was across the yard. And we lived in the Pacific Northwest with tons of old growth, or not old growth, but very mature cedar and fir, evergreens around us. And it'd be those dark, rainy nights, and the branches are swaying in the wind, and you have to go into this dark cave of a woodshed and fill up the wheelbarrow. And being like 11 years old, I mean, that's still kind of old to be scared of the dark, but I would freak out.
Screaming out there.
I wouldn't scream. You know what I do when I get scared. I definitely don't scream.
You don't make any noise.
Yes, I'm silent.
We have a couple screamers in our house when they get scared.
But that was like a very practical thing where it's like, okay, Joby loved that job. He would have done it for the rest of his life. It's like, no, you're done with this one. It's on Elisha now.
So
I think we'll have to do that.
to essentially shift responsibility because someone will get very comfortable carrying it and someone will be very comfortable letting it get carried.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And we don't want that to happen because we want each one of our sons and our daughter, they're going to go out into the world as their own people. They aren't going to always be this pack that works so well together. And so each one needs to be able to handle that.
Yeah. And I think one more thing too, because I already see the dynamic in some of our boys. The one that you said is extremely like one of ours, our oldest, like has a guilty conscience if he's not being a part of the work. It's like he knows, he feels that sense of duty, right? It's like, I got to get in there and do the work with them. And then some of our other kiddos, like you said, they're like, it doesn't bug them at all if everybody else is doing the work. But I think something else that I started learning and paying attention to and that my dad caught on to is that teaching your kids the capability. I think that you forget that you taught your firstborn how to do things. It's like you taught them how to do the pancake situation. You taught them how to weed the garden. And I think it's easy to then when it goes down the birth line to just tell the next kid to do it. Be like, hey, you get in there and help your brother pull the weeds, or hey, get out there and help your brother get the firewood in, and you actually weren't out there teaching the next one. And I think capabilities does bring a lot more likeliness of there being initiative taken. Because I think if you don't have the capability, it's like, well, I'm willing, I'm just not capable. And I think sometimes you need to teach willingness too, and they need to be willing. But I think oftentimes if you teach them the capability, they're far more willing.
That's good. I think that's a really big point. So I think those are a couple things: responsibility, privilege, communication around those things. Going into, a child that doesn't like to share, I'm going to kind of jump on a few questions that we've gotten here and try to answer those. I do think that it's important to let our children have ownership over things, especially when there's a lot of little kiddos and children that are smaller, aren't going to treat your special things special. We don't live in a socialist house, and not everybody's stuff is everybody's stuff. There are certain items that are family items, and we share with those items, but then there are certain things that, hey, you got it for your birthday, you really would like to protect that glass doll, or you really would like to protect that pocket knife or whatever it is, and you don't have to share that item. I do think that if our kids are constantly having their stuff taken away from them because there's a whiny baby that wants it, they're going to resent the baby. And frankly, you probably didn't let your oldest be the whiny baby as much as maybe you're letting the youngest be the whiny baby. I know that I'm so guilty of that, where I held our oldest to this really high standard, our older kiddos, when it came to just like attitude and discipline. We were really on top of them. And then sometimes I'll see our younger, toddler or baby start whining or fussing for something. And it's like, just give it to them. They're little, and it's like, what are you talking about? They need to learn. They just can't get everything handed to them just because they whine for it and they're cute, And so there is this element of intentionality with being a parent too, where it's like we still have to be intentional with these younger kiddos and training them just how we train the older kids. We can't constantly be pacifying them because that turns them into little hellions, and they aren't fun to be around. And we can't blame our older kids for not being around someone who's just going to whine and grab all their stuff and destroy it.
Yeah,
I mean, who wants to be around that?
That's a good point, because I do think even when they're the oldest child could quickly start to see kind of like the short-term benefit of pacifying the younger sibling. Where they're
see that sometimes in our home.
They're just kind of like, fine, take it. Or like, fine, like they don't want, like you said, hear the screaming and the crying and the whining. Like, okay, take this. I guess I'll go over here. But you do that over and over and over again. They're going to build up resentment. And obviously, the younger child's going to become a brat,
Well, I've seen that because there have been times when one of our children will demand something and I see the oldest child just give it to him. And that is immediately my cue to be like, okay, I am in lazy parenting mode. Be like, no, take that back. That's yours. I'm going to parent your younger sibling. sibling here, because they don't, like you said, want to hear the whines. They just rather give up the thing.
Yeah.
So anyways, I do think allowing ownership, I encourage trades a lot. We really encourage win-win in our household. That's a habit of highly successful people, and little kids can get really good at this. And so it's like, okay, if your little sibling has something that you would really like, why don't you trade them something? And maybe you can make a trade and everyone will be happy. So we do a lot of trades. Yeah. And the kids do that often with their younger siblings. Try to get them engaged somewhere else so they aren't as interested in what they're working on. But allowing ownership, I think, is important. Also, I think that when older kids know that you have their back just as much as you have the baby's back, or just as much as you have the little kid's back, it makes them want to stand by you.
Yeah.
And that means they aren't always the bad guy. And so like you're helping them protect special things. If they're building a castle and the toddler comes along and wrecks it, the toddler gets punished. The older child isn't just like, well, sorry, that's just what he is. He's just a little baby, you know? So I do think like having your kids back, all your children's back is very important. And I think sometimes we can forget that with the oldest child and just expect them to kind of fend for themselves and we look out for everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that might have been a part of this question that was asked, or maybe it was a different question altogether. And that is how do you regulate for the older kids, like they're building their Lego or they're building Dupelos and the kids, and then there's the crawler or whoever, the toddler comes and destroys it all. Like how do you regulate that? And I do think we try to make a point to have there be specific times, like, and we will, it of course depends on the time of the day that it is. And we'll tell the older kid, be like, hey, this just isn't a good time to build in the middle of the living room. We're not able to monitor the younger one. Cause especially if it's like right now we've got what is he, 8 months?
Yeah. So he's just, he's
the destroyer.
Yep. We call him the destroyer and everyone loves him. But he's not at the age where we're able to talk to him. Now the 2 or 3-year-old, when he was the destroyer, no, that it's not okay.
Exactly. You train that. Yeah. You train him out of that. And so that's a different scenario. But then when it comes to the younger one, like you said, the 8-month-old, like our kids get it. It's like, okay, like they are going to have plenty of time to build and to create when he's down for naps or after he goes to bed, or when mommy and daddy are feeding him, or I guess you're the one that feeds him. I don't know.
Mommy and daddy are feeding him. I mean, sometimes he has started to eat a few solids, so you've probably given him a blueberry here or there.
Yeah. I think I have fed him one of those packets, those pouches.
Yeah. So again, just like a good marriage, communication goes a long way when it comes to kids. And so instead of snapping at them, explaining the situation, where just even if it's quickly, it's like, hey, they're like, hey, so-and-so's destroying my Lincoln logs. And it's like, you know what? Right now is not a great time to build Lincoln logs. You can build them up on the window seat or up on the couch, but the floor I can't monitor right now. Mm-hmm. So you can do that at 10 o'clock when he goes down for his nap or after he goes to bed, or, so have times when they can work on their stuff. It's kind of an either or with this whole situation, I guess, when it comes to destroying stuff. It's never tolerated if it's a toddler that is capable of obeying. But when it comes to a baby, it's either sometimes you got to work around them and we all work together as a family. And other times it's like, hey, if you want uninterrupted play, here's a good time to do it. Yeah. There's a lot of different options. You have to be like, parenting, this whole parenting thing, it's so nuanced.
Yeah. Again, I do think that, I don't want to derail you from your points, but I just want to
have to share.
Jump in here again, because I do think this is a topic that, as we said in that red flags of big families, I'll hear parents say these phrases that in a flippant manner, just kind of like, oh, it'll all work out. Or it's like they'll appreciate it when they're older, or they'll see how blessed they were when they're older. And that's like not always the case. Like children having really bad experiences with their birth order and with their siblings exists. Like that's a thing that happens on the regular, and we want to avoid that. We don't want to take for granted that like, hey, it'll all work out. Like at some point as adults, they need to take responsibility for their life. They need to choose to not be a victim. They will be able to psychoanalyze and look in retrospect and deconstruct everything about their childhood. And there's going to be plenty of mistakes that we made. There's going to be plenty of, instances where they say they got shortchanged, and hopefully we teach them the character to acknowledge those things, embrace the life that they have now, and move on from there. Like, that's just a human trait, because it is.
Everyone has been shortchanged.
Exactly.
None of us live in a perfect bubble, and none of us ever will.
Yes, and that is a true frustration of just modern psychology that's crept into the church, is this whole psychoanalysis of your past and your history, and saying like, oh, this is why I am the way that I am. Now, I think people can probably find some, when there's real trauma instances, they can find a lot of freedom, but then those methods have been adopted into just like the average person, where like they've had a very average childhood. Nobody was beating them. Nobody was abusing them. And they're able to deconstruct and say, oh, the reason I have these selfish moments is because, my younger siblings took this thing from me when I was a kid. And in a lot of ways, they justify their sin as adults rather than take responsibility for it.
We literally just heard this on a podcast episode. It was hilarious because this guy was saying, it took me 22 years I didn't realize I had a bad childhood. He started out saying
that's
that.
Right.
I had a pretty normal childhood. I didn't realize how bad it was. It has taken me 22 years of therapy to go back and realize how traumatic it was.
Yeah.
And Elisha and I are kind of like, if it takes you 22 years to figure out that it was traumatic, maybe just chalk it up to a regular childhood and move on with your life.
And it wasn't, like, again,
it wasn't traumatic.
Anything that he shared on this podcast, and he wasn't a Christian, and I mean, I don't even know why I was listening to the podcast, to tell you the truth, but it wasn't this, like, because there are some true abusive scenarios. This wasn't that.
No.
This was like, I didn't realize, when my mom said this, she actually meant this. And it took me 22 years to realize that she was gaslighting me. And you're kind of like, what the heck are you talking about, dude?
We can go back and think the worst of our parents if we would like to. So This isn't to make light of true situations, but frankly, I think a lot of therapy today does make light of true trauma.
Exactly.
Because there are true trauma victims that need support.
Yes.
And when you make everyone a trauma victim, then no one is.
Yep.
And so it's really frustrating. Okay, but that's a total side point.
Well, yeah, but it pertains, I think, to realizing, like, yes, we need to be intentional with how we train our children. Like, we can get things wrong.
Yeah.
And so we need to be constantly doing audits of our parenting, be open to input from outsiders. I mean, again, we say this time and time again, but our parents are, they love us enough, and they apparently are confident enough in us, but they also care about our children enough and us to insert their opinion when they see something that concerns them, or they see something that they think we are maybe dropping the ball, an area that we're dropping the ball in, or an area that we're out of balance in. That is a gift, and you probably don't have that in your life right now. So you're probably gonna have to seek it out. Seek out older, wiser counsel, and then also just be aware that what worked last year for parenting might not work this year for parenting. What worked last week for parenting might not work this week for parenting, because of how fast children grow and how fast they adapt. And so anyways, I think always having that growth mindset as a parent, and in order to have a growth mindset, there needs to be this humility of realizing, like, by needing to grow, that implies that I could be doing something wrong right now.
Yeah, praying, seeking the Lord, and seeking unity as a couple, because I think it's so easy for one parent to think every man is right in his own eyes, right? And so it's easy to think, I know the best situation. I know the best way to raise these kids. Elisha, he's crazy or whatever. But when we don't have that unity, then we're choosing to not have the person closest to us who has insight to our hangups and what we're overlooking. We're not acknowledging that insight, and that's probably some of the best insight we can get. So if we can both align as parents, there's a lot of comfort in that, because we're both coming from different backgrounds and we're both seeking the Lord separately. And so if we're aligned, I feel like a lot more peace walking forward, even if you don't have a ton of people outside to speak into your lives. You can feel confident in your parenting situations moving forward, unified and seeking the Lord.
Yep.
I think it's really important. We kind of touched on this, but I think it's just important to mention real quick. Just hold everyone that's misbehaving accountable. So I don't think it's wrong at all to hold an older child accountable to, hey, it's never okay to push your baby brother down. Ever, ever, ever. You're getting punished for that. I'm also punishing the baby brother for coming over and stealing your stuff.
Right.
Or throwing a dirt clod at you, or whatever the case may be. Okay. Yeah. Like, he's not allowed to misbehave and you're not allowed to misbehave.
Yeah.
So don't just have this standard
That's the great frustration with like all sports fights, right? It's always the person retaliating that gets held accountable until like instant replay came in.
Well,
But so you need to,
like I know what you're talking about.
well, no, like that is, and I think that's so easy to do in parenting.
Yeah.
Is you punish the retaliation, and the instigator is just kind of like,
yeah, exactly. And you'll start to notice there's certain kids that are really good at pushing other kids' buttons. And then there's the kids that fly off the handle. And flying off the handle is never okay. But the button pusher needs to get punished too, because they make a really annoying spouse one day. And just human in general. Like no one wants to work with the button pusher. Like no one wants to work with someone who's like all sly and passive aggressive and gets everyone mad and never gets in trouble for it. So just... we need to be aware of that in our kids. Okay. I think using older children as a good example, not just a bad example. We're so quick to see the negative and say something about it, but are we just as quick to see the positive and say something about it? You know? So yeah, the oldest child, there will be times when I've said, why are you acting like this? You're the oldest. Stop acting like the 2-year-old, okay? And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, because an older child should act like an older child.
Right.
But then also being like, hey, everyone, do you see Leon right now? Do you see Lucy right now? Do you see how... their hands are at their side and they aren't picking their nose or whatever. Yep. We need to behave like that. Or do you see how calm they're being right now? We need to behave like that. So using them as a good example, not just as a negative example, it can just be helpful to make it more like, hey, make it more of a healthy mixed bag, I think. Yeah,
that's a good point, because it, like you said, we just naturally see the negative. That's like how people coach from that, they teach from that, they correct and instruct from just seeing the negative and correcting that. Versus, we've talked about this before, training up your children in the way they should go does imply a lot of proactivity. So you're not just reactionary in your parenting.
It's a lot harder.
Yeah, it's a lot harder, I think, and it's obviously requires more intention to proactively instruct and train, going back to teaching them capabilities instead of just reacting when they put their hands in their mouth, or whatever, or they pick their nose at the dinner table, teaching them, showing them where to put their hands, until it's time to eat, showing them those manners, or showing them how to sit still during reading time. And you're teaching them the thing instead of just waiting for them to do something wrong and snapping.
Come down like the hammer. I also think this is a really, really, really big one. If you have a very young child and they're already resenting being the oldest, I think this is probably the root cause.
Whoa.
Are you guys ready for it?
Why didn't we start with this?
I think a lot of it has more to do with influences than what that actual child is thinking or feeling. So just to explain, media, what are they reading? What books are they seeing at the library? What books are at library read-alouds? What books are saying, oh, I'm bringing home the baby and Angelina Ballerina doesn't like the baby because the baby is going to take all her toys and she has to share daddy and mommy and all these things. So often these books that are like, oh, we're going to help the child adjust is assuming a problem that is not even there.
Right. Does it need to be there?
It does not need to be there at all. And so it can also, it can be media. That's a really, really big one. And we don't let any of the media that is talking negatively about siblings, little siblings being annoying, into our home. That's just a no-go. Something else are peers. If kids are at daycare or they're at, primary school, this happens really, really little, where kids start parroting. Mm-hmm. And so they just start saying what what they hear and what they've been told, which is, oh yeah, my little brother's a pest. Mm-hmm. He's annoying. He always gets in all my stuff. It happens around our neighborhood so quick with these little kids, where I'm like, I don't think your brother so much is a pest as you've been told he's a pest.
Yeah.
So there's those things. And then the third thing is our own limiting beliefs. So maybe we grew up being told these things, we started believing them, and now we think our children, we have to pass them on. And so we start passing on these limiting beliefs that our child is going to resent the new baby, or they are going to be frustrated at their younger sibling, instead of just saying, hey, I gave you a gift here. This sibling is a gift. They are how awesome is it that you have a sibling?
Yes.
And living that out, I'm not saying pounding it over our kids' heads, but just having that be our belief system about children. We've never had a child resent another child coming into our family.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's a little, the pressure from our kids to have more children is a little overwhelming. They tell us every time we get in the car, we need a bigger car because we need to have another baby, one of our kiddos was just given a little speech and mentioned that on the speech that if we might need a bigger house because if we had 100 more kids, I'm not sure where we would put them, but our family's growing and we're very excited about that. Nice. And it's just so sweet to hear these little things. But the kids that our kids are around love their younger siblings.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they're annoying. I mean,
they're not annoying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone's annoying to everybody.
Yeah. I think that narrative about the negativity of a younger sibling, it's, I don't know. It permeates throughout culture. And I think that it's depending on how old your older children are when you're maybe pregnant with the next child, they're being catechized by your attitude towards it. Like you get to start, hyping them up about their sibling or, in your mind, preparing them for disappointment.
Yeah. Don't prepare them, hype them up.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. Because that narrative is common where like the 3-year-old's being told like, well, hey, get ready. You're going to have to start sharing. You're going to start sharing your room. You're going to not get all this quality time with mommy and daddy. You don't know what's coming. And maybe if the parent's not even saying it, grandparents or aunts and uncles or friends are saying that. So then you need to be all the more vigilant in countering that narrative in your home and being like, yeah, I tell you what, this is the greatest gift I could ever give you is a sibling. You can be best friends with them. You get to now, what's more common, like people not having enough stuff or people being lonely here in the 21st century?
Put that on a shirt.
And so it's like, I'm giving you somebody that you can be friends with, and there's going to be plenty of stuff for, far more children that we're capable of having. And now you have somebody that you get to play with, you get to create experiences with, and you get to create memories with. And so you get to choose the narrative early on.
Yeah, and it can start really early. You don't have to tell your kids that they're going to be best friends at 13 years old. If you have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old and the 3-year-old's kind of resisting the 1-year-old, we aren't saying that there aren't transition times that happen, where a child is getting used to another baby being in the home or something like that. That can be a very real transition, but just understanding that change is always difficult. Mm-hmm. And so we're just going to embrace change. Mm-hmm. And because there's nothing bad about this change, but sometimes change is still hard even when it's good. Yes. And so that's just going to be our perspective, and seeking out that child for extra time or being like, hey, why don't you come hang out with mommy and the baby? Or, these other things, having older kids and younger kids and taking them to go do stuff together can be really fun. Not just always having the older kids do stuff and the younger kids do stuff.
Yes.
We did the buddy system growing up. I think this is very common for very big families where an older child had a younger child and to, help with their food and help them, get dressed or whatever the case may be. And this wasn't burdensome. It was every once in a while throughout, a week. It wasn't like, I never felt like I was having to parent this child, but it was my sister Chloe, and I nicknamed her Bobo, and she was my little buddy, and we still have a bond to this day because I got to interact with Bobo and take care of her, and it's really, really sweet. Those are really, really sweet memories for both of us, and so I don't know. I think that it can just be a really, really special thing. Just assume the best, and if the worst happens, then deal with it. But in America, we just assume the worst when it comes to relationships. And I think that's because maybe our experience leads us to assume the worst, but we're starting fresh with our children, regardless of what baggage we might be carrying or what we went through. We get to start fresh and, have God's eyes for his design and share that design with our children and that excitement for his design, even if our experience didn't line up with that narrative.
Right. Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think those are the things that I wanted to share the most.
Awesome, Katie. I liked what you wrote down. I liked your perspective. I did.
Thanks. Hopefully it's encouraging. And this is, as with all of our things when we touch on parenting, this is not expert advice. We have very, very young children. We have a very long ways to go. I want you guys to know that. But I also want to be confident in what we believe to be true as well.
Yeah. Amen. Well, and I also think that we can confidently say this is worth thinking about and considering.
Yeah. Hopefully it just spawns a conversation with you and your spouse or you and your child. And gives you some stuff to think about and talk about.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.